On the night of February 3rd, 1959, a Pan Am Boeing 707 was cruising at 35,000 feet over the North Atlantic, roughly 4 months into commercial jet service. The autopilot was engaged. The air was smooth. Nothing about the flight suggested anything was wrong. Then, the captain stepped out of the cockpit to walk through the cabin, a routine, permitted practice at the time. And while he was gone, the autopilot silently disengaged. Nobody noticed. The aircraft began a slow, gentle spiral to the right, so smooth that the co-pilot, occupied with paperwork and waiting on a weather broadcast, didn't register that anything had changed. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the 707 was no longer gently doing anything. It had entered a steep, diving spiral, its speed climbing toward the edge of what the airframe could survive. In under 2 minutes, the aircraft fell nearly 29,000 feet. The captain rushed back to the flight deck. Working together, the crew fought the airplane back under control at around 6,000 feet, perilously close to the ocean below, and limped to an emergency landing in Gander, Newfoundland, on damaged flaps. Everyone survived. The aircraft did not go unscathed. The airframe absorbed serious structural stress before the crew ever regained control. It's tempting to call this a story about a mistake. In the most immediate sense, it was. The official investigation found the co-pilot hadn't been monitoring the instruments closely enough to catch the disengagement in time. But that answer only raises the more interesting question. These were experienced professional aviators, flying for one of the most respected airlines in the world. So why didn't the systems and the habits that had kept crews safe for decades catch this one before it became a near catastrophe? The answer has less to do with any single person, and more to do with the airplane itself, and what it quietly demanded of everyone who flew it. To understand what changed, you have to understand what flying felt like just a few years earlier. Crossing an ocean in the 1950s meant hours aboard a propeller airliner like the Douglas DC-7 or the Lockheed Constellation, droning along at 15 or 16,000 feet. Low enough that weather wasn't something you climbed above, it was something you flew straight through. 4 piston engines ran the entire flight, each one a complex mechanical system prone to trouble. Losing one mid-flight wasn't unheard of. Pilots developed their skill through feel, the vibration in the yoke, the sound of the engines, gradual and forgiving responses to gradual and forgiving inputs. Airlines wanted something faster. Engineers, watching military jets already slicing across the sky at speeds propeller aircraft could never reach, saw the future clearly. The only real question left was whether pilots trained on an entirely different kind of flying could adapt to something built on entirely different principles. The Boeing 707 didn't simply fly faster than what came before it. It behaved like a different category of machine. Its wings swept sharply backward, a shape drawn directly from Boeing's own military jet programs, the B-47 and B-52, which had already taught the company's engineers how swept wings delay drag at high speed, and how that same swept shape introduces a rolling yawing instability called Dutch roll, something straight-winged propeller aircraft essentially never experienced. If you're enjoying this documentary, consider subscribing. Every video here is carefully researched to bring you the real stories, remarkable aircraft, and pivotal moments that shaped aviation history. Now, let's continue. Boeing had already developed a corrective system for it, the yaw damper, based on that military experience, but the characteristic itself was entirely unfamiliar to pilots coming from aircraft like the DC-7 or the Constellation. Its 4 jet engines solved the reliability problems of piston engines, but they responded to the throttle in a completely different rhythm. A piston engine answers almost the instant you move the throttle. A jet engine has to spool up, a real measurable delay between asking for power and getting it, especially at low altitude and low speed, exactly the phase of flight where sudden power is often needed most.
And it flew markedly higher than propeller airliners ever had, in thinner air, above most of the weather instead of it, smoother for passengers, but a genuinely different aerodynamic environment for the pilots managing it. None of these were flaws. Each solved a real, specific problem in propeller aviation, but each one also quietly asked something new of the person in the left seat. And in 1959, the industry was still discovering exactly what that was.
Pilots transitioning onto the 707 went through structured ground school and flight training. Airlines took the transition seriously, and this was not a case of handing experienced captains the keys and hoping for the best. For most crews, the dominant early impression was pride and something close to astonishment, a smoothness and a sense of power that propeller flying had never offered. Climb performance that used to take agonizing minutes on a fully loaded DC-7 now happened in a fraction of the time. The vibration that had always accompanied propeller flight, so constant nobody thought to mention it, was simply gone. Passengers noticed the same thing from the cabin. Flights that once took most of a day now took hours. For the traveling public, the difference didn't feel like an incremental improvement, it felt like stepping into a different era of travel entirely. But underneath that success, a specific and repeated pattern was emerging in accident investigations during the 707's first 5 years in service, one that had nothing to do with pilot skill in the traditional sense, and everything to do with how differently this aircraft needed to be watched and flown at its margins. The pattern shows up clearly if you look at what actually happened case by case in the years just after the 707 entered service. On August 15, 1959, an American Airlines 707, Flight 514, a training flight, was practicing simulated engine failures near Calverton, New York, with instructor and trainee pilots aboard. During one exercise, the aircraft developed excessive yaw from the asymmetric thrust of the simulated failure at a low altitude and low airspeed where the swept-wing jet's margin for recovery was far smaller than crews coming from propeller aircraft were used to. The crew didn't correct it in time. The aircraft rolled, lost control, and crashed, killing all 5 aboard, the first fatal accident involving a 707. The Civil Aeronautics Board's investigation concluded the crew had failed to recognize and correct the developing yaw quickly enough, at an altitude that left no room to recover. In direct response, the FAA discontinued the requirement that crews practice full, low-altitude landings with 2 engines failed on the same side. Those exercises were moved to higher, safer altitudes going forward. 2 months later, on October 19, 1959, a new Boeing 707 was on an acceptance and training flight for Braniff International Airways over Washington State. A Boeing test pilot at the controls deliberately demonstrated a Dutch roll to familiarize the Braniff crew with the motion and its recovery, standard practice at the time. But the maneuver was taken well beyond the bank angle limits considered safe, and a recovery attempt by the newly type-rated Braniff captain compounded rather than corrected it. The oscillation grew violent enough to tear 3 of the aircraft's 4 engines from the wings. The crew still managed to crash land the aircraft along a riverbed near Arlington, Washington. 4 of the 8 people aboard were killed. The Civil Aeronautics Board's investigation was direct in its conclusion. There had been no valid instructional reason to push the maneuver that far. A little over a year later, in January 1961, another American Airlines 707, again on a training flight, again practicing engine-out procedures, crashed off Montauk Point, New York, after an unexplained loss of control. All 6 aboard were killed. And in February 1963, a Northwest Airlines Boeing 720, a close relative of the 707 sharing its swept-wing design, was climbing out of Miami on a scheduled passenger flight when it flew into a severe thunderstorm. The investigation found the aircraft encountered strong vertical air currents and that the crew's large control inputs on the elevator, combined with those drafts, produced a violent pitch upset the aircraft could not recover from before it broke apart in flight.
All 43 aboard were killed. It was a stark demonstration that inexperience with how a jet needed to be flown through severe turbulence, a flying technique nobody needed to develop for propeller aircraft in quite the same way, could be just as dangerous as inexperience with any single system or maneuver. Different mechanisms, different specific failures, but a common thread running underneath all of them. A genuinely new machine being flown in its early years by extraordinarily experienced people whose experience had, in each case, been built on something else. It's worth being clear about what this pattern was not. It was not recklessness, and it was not a poorly engineered airplane. Each of these investigations pointed to specific, correctable gaps in training procedures, in maneuver limits, in cockpit monitoring discipline, not to any fundamental flaw in the aircraft itself. The 707 went on to become one of the most influential and, over its full service life, reliable airliners ever built.
Every one of these incidents produced a direct, traceable change. After the Calverton accident, the FAA rewrote the rules for how engine-out maneuvers could be practiced, moving them to altitudes with real recovery margin. Boeing issued a service bulletin adding hydraulic boost to the rudder system, giving crews more directional control at exactly the low-speed conditions that had proven so unforgiving. The Dutch roll accident hardened an already forming consensus that yaw dampers weren't optional convenience equipment for swept-wing jets. They were essential, and their proper use and understanding became a fixed part of jet-type training industry-wide. And the broader pattern, visible across all of these cases, helped push the industry toward a training philosophy that treated the jet as a genuinely different airplane, requiring dedicated simulator work, not simply a faster version of what pilots already knew. That shift, the idea that a sufficiently different aircraft demands dedicated, systematic simulator training before a pilot ever touches the real controls, is now considered a foundational principle of commercial aviation safety. It didn't arrive as an abstract policy. It arrived because the industry looked honestly at a specific, documented cluster of incidents in the early jet age and rebuilt its standards around exactly what they revealed. Which brings the story back to that Pan Am crew over the North Atlantic, fighting to recover an airplane that had, almost silently, entered a dive that came within thousands of feet of the ocean. Their incident didn't share a mechanism with the Dutch roll accident in Washington state, or the training crash at Calverton, or the thunderstorm upset off Miami, but it shared the same underlying lesson repeating itself from a different angle. This was an aircraft that flew faster, higher, and with far less margin for a lapse in attention than anything these crews had flown before. And the industry's habits hadn't yet fully caught up to that reality. They caught up, not all at once and not without real cost. The men lost at Calverton, at Arlington, and over the Everglades paid the price for lessons the rest of the jet age has never had to relearn. But every one of those investigations fed directly into the training standards, the hardware changes, and the cockpit discipline that came to define safe jet operation for the decades that followed. The Boeing 707 didn't just carry the world into the jet age. It forced the people flying it, and the industry standing behind them, to figure out, case by documented case, exactly what that new age required.